Good evening. Thank you for coming. Thanks for your patience as we started this program. I'm Madeline Rosenberg, the library's public humanities specialist, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us, both in person and virtually, and also add that this program is presented with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight's hybrid event will run for about 1 hour. We will hear from Sahar Aziz in conversation with Behrooz Ghamari-Tabrizi about her new book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. Following a conversation between the speakers, we will reserve about 15 minutes for Q&A from both our in-person and virtual audiences. Sahar Aziz is Professor of Law and Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers Law School and the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Aziz's scholarship examines how race and religion intersect with national security law to disproportionately impact minorities in domestic and international counterterrorism. She is a Soros Equality Fellow, recipient of the Derek Bell Award from the American Association of Law Schools, and author of The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. Behrooz Ghamari-Tabrizi is Professor and Chair of Near Eastern Studies and Director of Sharman and Bijan Mosavar Rahami. He holds a PhD in sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is the author of 3 books on different aspects and historical context of the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and its aftermath: Islam and Dissent in Post-Revolutionary Iran, Foucault in Iran, Islamic Revolution After the Enlightenment, and Remembering Akbar, Inside the Iranian Revolution. He has written extensively on the topics of social theory and Islamist political thought in different journals and book chapters. So there are just a few housekeeping items I'd like to mention. This room is T-Coil enabled, so if you have T-Coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't but would like to use one of our headsets, we have some available on the piano over there. Please know that masks are optional in the library, and we encourage you to do whatever feels comfortable. For those of you on Crowdcast, we recommend that you use Chrome for this experience and close other tabs that aren't necessary, especially any that are playing video or audio. And please avoid having multiple Crowdcast tabs open at the same time if you can, so you have a better viewing experience. Please note that this event is being recorded, and recordings are typically uploaded onto the library's YouTube channel at a later date. And finally, if you have any thoughts or comments throughout the program, please enter them in the chat box. If you have a question you'd like addressed at the end of the program, please enter in the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen. And then I finally wanted to mention that this book is available at our partner, Labyrinth Books, which is a wonderful bookstore, and it's also in the library's collection. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Professor Ghamari-Tabrizi, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Madeline. It's a pleasure to be here in conversation with Sahar Aziz. This is one of those experiences that you read a book and you constantly go, aha, aha, but I think for people who are reading this book, I usually, whenever I have this kind of conversation, I start with the question, so what prompted you to write this book? But then I thought that that's kind of a dumb question to begin this conversation, because it's so superfluous to ask this question, because everyone who lives in this country, who been here for any extended time, would understand what a crucial and important point you're making here, and how important the topic of the book is. And also, as I was reading the book, it constantly, although I always say that I would never quote Carl Schmitt, but they constantly forced me to think about this Nazi political philosopher Carl Schmitt, who basically argues that all political entities are founded in constitutive terms on the premise of creating insiders and outsiders. Even, of course, he was a critic of liberal democracies, and even liberal democracies, he says, that are founded on this basic premise of insiders and outsiders, friends and enemies. And without such distinction, these political forms cannot operate. And you get why I kept thinking about his idea that you go through century and a half or possibly more of American history and how these concepts of insiders and outsiders were envisioned, articulated, and put into practice. And I want to highlight this question of constitutive part of these political formations. And you highlight this constitutive part as a racial understanding of American society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the distinction in your book is that you also link that racial formation to religious beliefs and communities, and vice versa. I mean, religion and race have this kind of an uneasy relationship with one another in American history. So I want to start the conversation with this broad question that you are thinking about religion and race in a conversation and in the way they constitute one another, and how it's been appropriated in American history in different forms, from Jews, from Mormons, from Catholics, and then its latest kind of reincarnation in Muslims in the U.S. So the book is called, of course, The Racial Muslim, but one can easily think of the book as a book about racial religious communities, because you bring in so many of these different kinds of experiences into light. So talk a little bit about why do you think that speaking about Muslims and Islamophobia in the U.S. needs to be connected to the question of race, and how is it racialized throughout?
Well, thank you so much. First, I just want to thank you, Behrooz, for taking the time to speak with me. It's such an honor. For those who know his work well, it's really a privilege to be in conversation with you. And thank you to the Princeton Public Library for hosting this event. Your question does in many ways lead to the common first question of any discussion on a book about why did you write this book? And beyond the obvious, as you noted, that we are living and swimming and breathing the air of the so-called war on terror and all of its consequences domestically and internationally. What led me to the book, or the impetus behind the book, was actually something more narrow than that was connected to my own legal training. So I, as a civil rights lawyer, which is what I practiced before I became an academic, you have to have somewhat of a leap of faith, or make a leap of faith in the Constitution and in statutes that at least proclaim to protect civil rights and proclaim to protect minorities in particular against discrimination. So I'm living in this country that also I was raised in as someone who was born in Cairo, Egypt, and has experienced firsthand through my own family the consequences of being in states that unfortunately have authoritarian practices, and also studying a region of the world that has attempted multiple times to have their version of democracy. So I was quite attuned to the importance of individual rights, right? And I thought I was in a country that took individual rights seriously, although in an imperfect system, but at least one that was genuine and authentic in its attempts to protect individual rights. So as I was working in civil rights in the field, and as I was researching more as I entered academia, the question that just kept popping up in my mind was, why is this happening in the United States of America when it says very clearly in the very first amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and there's similar amendments in almost nearly, if not every state constitution, that religion is protected, the free exercise of religion. And that we had multiple statutes that also reinforced that fundamental legal right. And yet, what was happening to Muslims for 20 years was clearly antithetical to that. It was contradictory. And so I kept asking, how can a country, or how can a religious minority be so openly and overtly discriminated against and vilified in a country that proclaims proudly to privilege religious freedom, legally and normatively? And that's really the research question that I kept trying to find the answer to. And I looked for a book that I was hoping would answer the question. I couldn't find the book, so I had to try to write the book. So that's kind of how I got there. And and that's why the first half of the book is about Jews, Mormons, and Catholics. Because as you try to answer that question, you also then ask, well, is this new? Is this unique? Is this something about Muslims, uniquely about the relationship between Islam and the United States, Muslims and the United States? Or is there actually something much more fundamental at play here, where this is the latest iteration, and then the question becomes, how is it different? And what I found was that the scholarship that did exist when I was trying to answer the question was siloed. And you had the race studies and the race scholarship talking in one area, and then you had the religious studies talking in a different area, and they weren't talking to each other. And what I found was that you could not understand what people tended to call as merely religious bigotry, which I don't think adequately explains what's happening to Muslims, without understanding how racism operates. And you couldn't call what was happening to Muslims merely racism, because their religion had a lot to do with why they were experiencing forms of racism. So ultimately what I've tried to do is merge those two literatures to understand that intersection of the racialization of religious identity. And what I argue is that Muslim identity, similar to Jewish identity, Catholic identity, and Mormon identity, especially in the first half of the 20th century, is a racial marker. That's the effect. That's how it works. And I always compare it to phenotype because for various reasons in the United States, the concept, the social construction of race has historically and continues contemporarily to be defined primarily by phenotype, what you look like, your skin color. So your skin color racializes you. And what I'm arguing is with Muslims, especially post 9/11, and I'm not saying it started post 9/11, I go, as you know, into a history before 9/11, but especially post 9/11, your Muslim identity is now the racial marker. And then once you are racialized, there are then the consequences, the material consequences, the political, the economic, the dignitary consequences of being an outsider.
No, you raise a very important question in the book that in relation to the question of race and phenotype, but Muslims, as we know, come from all over the world, and how to identify Muslims racially is a little bit of a kind of an elaborate, kind of complicated project. We can think of Indonesians, Chinese, South Asians, Middle Easterners, and Europeans, African Americans. So how do you sort of deal with this question? Because in earlier cases, for example, for the case of Jews in America or Jews in Germany, of course, Jews were considered to be a different race in Germany, and even experiences of Italians and Irish, they were truly were understood to be a different race. Even when they came to the U.S., they were marked as a different race. For Muslims, it's a little bit more complicated, right? And because how do you sort of find a racial category to identify Muslims with?
Right. So I'm not arguing in the book that Muslims are in fact a race. I'm arguing they're being racialized. And if we go back to, and you're correct, if you look at how Jews and Catholics from Italy, from Ireland, Jews from Eastern Europe primarily, were socially treated, they were treated as non-whites. And in fact, and I talk about this in the book, the early 20th century was the era of eugenics, which is effectively scientific racism. And there was a national report that was quite influential. It was published in 1911 that had 46 different races. And 36 of those races, 45 different races, and 36 of those races were originating from Europe. So just to give you context of how completely arbitrary the concept of race is. Yet at the same time, so you have these multiple divisions within Europe, people of European origin, and keeping in mind that between 1900 and 1930, 16 million people immigrated to the United States, most of whom were from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Ireland. So you have this huge influx of people who are Catholic and Jewish. And that is considered a threat to the majority Northwest European Protestant population. So, and yet, by law, they were white. So it was kind of, there was this social construction of race, and then there was the legal definition of race. So they were legally white in contrast to Asians, and therefore they could naturalize to become US citizens. And when you're dealing with Muslims, what I'm arguing is not so much that, well, first, if you are from the Middle East or North Africa, you are legally white on the US Census. I think we all know that socially, people from the Middle East and North Africa, especially post 9/11, have not been treated as white in terms of the privileges that come with being socially white. So there's also a disconnect between what the law says and socially what's operating, which then kind of begs the question of what these legal categories even mean. But what I'm arguing in this, what I call the social construction of the racial Muslim, is that socially, because of media, because of government rhetoric, because of government national security policy, because of government foreign policy, there has become this social construction of this race that is called the Muslim. Right? I'm not saying it's real in terms of any kind of objective fact. And that social construction is Arab-looking. So there is a phenotypical image, and much of that is based on the media's image. And so interestingly, if someone is Indonesian and Muslim, they are less likely to even be presumed to be Muslim. They may be more subjected to anti-Asian, anti-Far East Asian discrimination. But if you're anywhere, if you even look like you're from the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and your name is Muhammad, or your name is Fatima, or you have something that lets people know, or you wear the hijab, that you are Muslim, then now you are subject to the racialization process. And what is that? You are presumed to be illiberal. You're presumed to be misogynistic, especially if you're a male. You're presumed to be sympathetic to terrorism and terrorist groups. You're presumed to be anti-American and disloyal. At the very least, you have dual loyalties to Al-Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah. You are presumed to be violent. You have a tendency to be violent or to support politically motivated violence. And none of this is factually true. It's just these are the types of stereotypes that now you have to overcome individually to prove, no, I'm not this or this or this or this. And these are burdens that you have to carry. And those stereotypes, some of them overlap, but they're quite distinct from the stereotypes that, for example, African Americans have to deal with, which is a product of the legacies of slavery, that they're inherently criminal, that they're lazy, that they're intellectually inferior, right? That they are, bad citizens and not contributing to society. None of this is true, but those stereotypes are perceived as true, believed as true by sufficient parts of the government and the public to then allow for, justify, fund, and create systems of oppression. Right? Mass incarceration, school-to-jail pipeline, disparate sentencing and criminal justice for certain types of crimes to intentionally disproportionately hurt African Americans. So the racialization process is pernicious, not simply because in and of itself it might be wrong, it's because it has very real material effects, and it's necessary to justify repressive action by the state and by private actors without making those people feel like, oh, maybe I'm oppressive, maybe what I'm doing is antithetical to my own belief system, maybe I don't respect religious freedom, or that I am supporting a racist, system. But when you have when the racialization process works, then people can cognitively justify that type of behavior as rational, as patriotic, as necessary, and as justified. And that's then when you start getting, and those are just some of the examples of what you, going back to your insider, outsider.
Sorry. In the book, you also talk about this, that one of the distinctions of Muslims' experience in the US, and possibly also more importantly in Europe, is this trajectory of colonialism, Orientalism, and this kind of long history of combination of historical imagination, which is very much rooted in kind of European encounters with the Ottoman Empire, and as Muslims as subjects to be feared and exoticized at the same time. And now coming all together, possibly in a more kind of profound way in the European experience, that concept of, from the British Cultural Studies, the Empire Strikes Back, that is really an important element of thinking about Muslims in the U.S. And which again, possibly in your next book you can compare that to European experiences, which is quite distinct. But at the same time, this is it generates a fascinating kind of puzzle that Muslims in the U.S. are among the most educated communities in the U.S. because, of course, this is like a brain drain from Muslim majority countries around the world. I tell you this little story that when I was in the Bay Area, we had an event in one of these big corporations' private park, and the president of the company sent a memo to his VPs saying that Iranians are in this park and people don't know quite why are they here, and he had 5 VPs, 3 of them were Iranian, so Iranians getting the memo that Iranians are coming to the park. But that's a good example of how Muslims in the U.S. In so many different ways, in terms of social stratification, in terms of class, there's so much part of American affluent and middle classes, educated classes, and these kind of racialized notions of Muslims are a bit complex to see how they are actually manifested in reality. Of course, we have Hollywood, we have sort of media that they depict Muslims, but in real experiences, it's a sort of a very sort of uneasy relation between that image and the realities of Muslims' experiences in the U.S.
Yeah. So one of the kind of sub-questions I had as I was doing the research, which comes up often in the conversations about post 9/11 discrimination in the U.S., is how much did 9/11 matter in this process? And in the beginning, admittedly, much of the discourse was hyper-focused on 9/11 as the only inflection point, as if it was utopic before then. And when you dig deeper, and I'm sure you can, as a researcher of Iran and the Iranian Revolution, you can appreciate the impact of, for example, the Iranian Islamic Revolution of '79 on the way that Iranians, and then by extension, all Arabs, even though Iranians are not Arab, but all Middle Easterners as terrorists, as these violent anti-American savages. And so part of racialization is that reality doesn't matter. I mean, that's what's so pernicious about it. The stereotypes take over and they create they shape people's perceptions, and then that's how they behave in terms of what they support, in terms of government policies or what they're willing to fight for or not. But going back to what you said, in my book, I argue there are four major kind of macro factors that all feed into the racialization of Muslims before 9/11 and then continue after 9/11, but really start before. And that is white Protestant dominance. Some people will call it white Protestant supremacy, but that's just effectively what we all know, which was this country was founded by, English Protestants. And as a result, their values, their norms, their history is the dominant version in school books, and that's why there's a big conflict, I think, right now, is there's a pushback behind allowing that to be the dominant, the norm, the default. But that's a reality that's affected pretty much every minority, any group that doesn't belong to that group. The second is you have xenophobia and coercive assimilationism of immigrants that is also part of the American story. And that's been going on, again, since immigrants came voluntarily. And regardless where you come from in the world, is there's always this pressure to assimilate in terms of what language you speak, how you define your culture, what foods you eat, your identity into this mold that, again, is really based on this Northwest European Protestant norm, right? And so the melting pot is somewhat of a myth. There's a little truth to it, but I don't think that it's as much a melting pot as it is a coercive assimilationist. And when there is some movement on multiculturalism, you see this backlash. We saw it in the 90s, and we're seeing it now, right? The third is Orientalism. And Orientalism is both European Orientalism that then has an offspring of American Orientalism, which I argue really takes shape after World War II, which is when America becomes the great power in the Middle East. And France and Britain secede, right, and are no longer like the major Western hegemonic power. And then the fourth is American empire in Muslim majority countries, which we certainly saw in full display in the last 20 years, from in Afghanistan to Iraq, and then through the proxy wars, and that predates 9/11, obviously. So when we talk about Orientalism, I see European Orientalism as one factor that was, and it was certainly imported. And this clash of civilizations was not new. That certainly is not a post 9/11 narrative, and it's not a uniquely American. It's actually a European narrative, as you said, between the Ottomans and the Europeans. And I highlight that only because many people in the United States who went through the school system, including me, we're not taught that. We're not even taught about this clash of civilizations narrative between the Ottoman, the Mohammedan Turks, and the Europeans. And it matters because it's imported. It's brought here, right, over time. So in the post 9/11 era, the question is how much of that still lingers? How much of that is, and obviously we have Edward Said's work and Joseph Massad's work, and there are many others who have talked about Orientalism. But I think that you can't really understand Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism without incorporating these four factors. And then when you take those four factors, then I take it to one more level and go, there are 7 major international events, or crises, if you want to call them, that essentially were building blocks that got us to 9/11. So the population was being primed to racialize Muslims. And Muslims were racialized before then, but it was in this ebb and flow. And what I think 9/11 did that is monumental, and again, people can disagree with me, but this is my conclusion, is that it was kind of the final brick that said this is now a permanent structure in American race politics, which is Islamophobia. So those 7 events are the creation of Israel in 1948, the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, the 1991 First Gulf War, and the 1993 World Trade Center Organization. And the reason why I argue those 7 events are so important is because each time they occurred, They gathered enormous media attention in ways that portrayed the Arabs or the Muslims, again, all conflated together, and no difference between Persian and Arab and Christian Arab and Muslim Arab and Jewish Arab, but everybody, and that's part of racialization, is the essentialization and homogenization of diversity and complexity, and into these stereotypes: savage, irrational, anti-American, illiberal, despotic, backward, uncivilized. And so each time you would have this burst of this attention in that way, and then it would kind of die down, and then it would happen again. But I see it more as breaks. And each time there were consequences for those who were in the US who were either directly or indirectly associated or perceived to be associated with the enemies in that conflict, right? So whether you were the Palestinians in, say, in the 1967 war, where they were all portrayed as savages, the Arabs were all portrayed as if they were attacking the Israelis for no reason, as if there was no context. It was a vacuum. As this is a conflict, and it's a conflict over land, and it's not just purely religious bigotry. Same thing with 1973, with the Arab oil embargo. You may disagree with what the Arabs did, but they did it there was a political reason, and they were opposed to the U.S.'s policy in the Middle East, especially when it came to, again, the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Sinai, et cetera. So we can go, and the same thing with 1979. So the point is there is no perspective given to the people of this is complicated, this is a conflict, here's the different perspectives, and you, as opposed to they're evil and they're good. They're the bad guys, they're the good guys. You're either with us or you're against us. That rhetoric was quite explicit post 9/11, but it wasn't the first and only time that's happened. And so what I'm hoping the book will do is make people understand that, like other minority groups, whether you're talking about Chinese or Japanese, or you're talking about Jewish, Eastern European Jews, or Irish Catholics, or Italian Catholics, or African Americans, or Native Americans, just like them, there is a history that culminates so that when 9/11 happens in these 20 years of pretty, again, open Islamophobia, you start to realize, this is actually quite more predictable. This is not so un-American or non-American as one would be told it is when you're educated in the school system. So the book is very intentionally trying to provoke some critical thinking on the way we're taught about history in the U.S.
And I also like the fact that when you make that connection with the race and how Muslims are racialized, it attributes somewhat an inherent characteristics and unchanging characteristics. That was, of course, that was key to Jewish experience.
Yes.
To Mormons' experience, but these are important, and I think that's very well articulated in the book. That's really the connection, and then people. I don't know whether I should mention names, but the roots of Muslim rage of our own Bernard Lewis here, that creates that kind of trans-historical inherent characteristics that what makes Muslims tick is the failure of the siege of Vienna in 16th century rather than the whole history of colonialism. That's and that's an important kind of sort of connection there, and I think that.
And my question is, why would that even be published in a mainstream venue and have salience and resonate? It's one thing for some academic to have that view. Fine, it's a free country, you have free speech, academic freedom. But the real question is, how could a view like that become the mainstream view? And to me, that's the real travesty, is that there's an environment that's willing to accept that.
Of course, I mean the answer to that question is that if you have discursive authority, you can make it a mainstream view. And believe me, from Princeton, there's a lot of discursive authority that emanates from here. But I wanted to, before opening our conversation to some questions from our audience, talk a little bit about the question of gender. And you do talk about the question of gender, but it comes towards the end of the book, and I think one of the distinctions about the racial Muslim experience and the entire sort of discourse of Islamophobia, it's motivated by that kind of assertion, when Spivak says, saving brown women from brown men by white men, and I think that's quite an important element, feature of this the dominance of Islamophobia, and that's something that I like the fact that you talk about this, that what a powerful discourse that gender dimension was for American liberals, to go save women of Afghanistan, go save Muslim women who were being subjugated and oppressed by Muslim men. And I remember walking in New York City, these giant posters of Amnesty International saying that, keep up the good job, NATO, liberating the Afghan women. And I said, what? Amnesty International is spending like a lot of money defending NATO's operation in Afghanistan. So there you realize that how deeply rooted that kind of perception of Islam and Muslim communities are, even within this kind of supposedly left side of liberalism in American politics. And I wanted to sort of, if you could talk a little bit more about that gender dimension, that how it kind of comes into play when you talk about Muslims' experiences as racialized community.
Yes, no, gendered Islamophobia is certainly a dimension of Islamophobia. And that, I think, is probably the most prevalent form before 9/11. What we saw more of before 9/11 was this, especially in the 1990s, the conversations about multiculturalism, and there was a famous book called "Is Multiculturalism Good for Women?" And the emphasis was not uncoincidentally, or it was intentionally about a lot of it was about Muslim women. Because the argument was, well, Western liberalism will save Muslim women from their misogynistic, repressive cultures. And what I found after 9/11, so that's part of Orientalism, and that's been going on for quite a while, even before World War II. But after 9/11, what I saw was this really fascinating dynamic where saving Muslim women was only relevant for purposes of destroying Muslim societies. For example, Afghanistan. It was pretext in order to justify war and conquest. But it wasn't about the women themselves. And I'm not even willing to acknowledge that the way that the so-called problem is described is accurate by any means. But even that wasn't there. Even though, no, we have good intentions and we're really trying to help women, I don't think they cared anything about women. Those who supported the war in Iraq, those who supported the war in Afghanistan, those who supported the war on terror. But there was something else that was happening post 9/11 that was quite different. And I wrote a law review article called "From the Oppressed to the Terrorist: Muslim Women Caught in the Crosshairs of Intersectionality." So I use intersectionality theory. And what I found was that Muslim women went from being these infantilized, patronized subjects, like children to be saved by liberal white women in particular, liberated by them, to being these suspicious characters. We think are you sympathizing or are you co-conspiring with your male terrorists? Because post 9/11, anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia was very gendered male. It was gendered as male, right? The stereotypes, the terrorist other. And that shows in the national security practices of the state, it shows in the media depictions. And so we've seen that men have disproportionately been harmed by post 9/11 Islamophobia. But women have also been harmed, it's just in different ways, that they're, again, extensions of the men. So, which presumes they have no independent thinking, that they aren't their own people, don't have their own minds, and that they are, and that their religious beliefs teach them to support what the American public thought was a violent political ideology. I mean, there are swaths of American society that doesn't even believe Islam is a religion, and they've said it publicly. This is not a religion. This is a violent political ideology. And that's how they reconcile mistreatment of a religious minority, is they don't believe that they're violating religious freedom. They believe that they are keeping themselves safe from a violent threat, and that threat is a suspect race, and therefore we can keep religious freedom intact, we can continue to decry our own assaults on religious freedom as Christian conservatives, and we can support all these national security practices. The other way that women were affected is, especially if you were wearing the hijab, because then that's certainly a racial marker, is they tended to be subjected to high levels of physical and verbal assault. So the anger or they were targets, as not that men were not targets, but they were certainly targeted quite a bit. And that there were many conversations and there were some pieces in public in the media about women who had decided to take off their headscarves because they were afraid. This was especially in the first 5 years after 9/11. They were just afraid that they were going to be attacked. But having said that, I think that gendered Islamophobia post 9/11 is an under-researched area, and I think it mandates or it warrants more empirical research, because what's missing in the scholarship, and my book did not fix this problem because it wasn't planned, I didn't intend it. So we don't have enough empirical research. We really do need more sociological research and ethnographic research, because as you said, the Muslim communities here are so diverse, and there are different waves of them who are the 70% that are not African American. The first wave was the brain drain wave, right? The best and the brightest and the hardest working who came, and many of them did pursue graduate degrees and then became professionals. The second wave tends to be the family members of those, because that's how you get your green card, right? Is through family. It's very difficult to get even a work visa. Or there's a lottery for the North Africans, they're eligible for the lottery. And that wave is a much more mixed. So they're not all necessarily as affluent or as highly educated as the first wave. And that in itself plus the racial diversity, plus the national origin diversities, right? So I do hope that the book triggers more empirical research to try to kind of prove many of these theories that I put forward.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to end my part of this with a little sort of passage at the last sentence of your book.
Okay.
I am by nature a very pessimistic person. And the last sentence in your book sort of hits a very kind of high note of optimism. And I want to read it and see whether this is, I'm reading this sentence from the depth of my pessimism that sounds optimistic, but it's truly your intention to say, for it is the freedom and willingness to examine and eradicate racialized double standards that distinguishes America from other nations. Is this an optimistic note that the distinction that we have in the U.S., in America, that possibility is there of eradicating?
Yes, I think it is the freedom to have these conversations and to challenge the power, to attempt to challenge status quo and systems of oppression that keeps me optimistic in an area of work that is generally quite depressing. And I say that kind of going back to the initial statements I made in this talk is, and you and I have this in common, that we research the Middle East and we're very familiar with, not just in the Middle East, I mean, there's places in Europe and there's places in every continent, but we're very sensitive to the reality that there are systems of oppression around the world, and in democracies and authoritarian states and other forms of government. But there are not very many countries where people can challenge those systems of oppression without facing death, torture, kidnapping, and other very high costs. And so that's what keeps me optimistic. And it also, I think, it imposes a burden on all of us and responsibility to take advantage of that freedom and not be complacent, because so many other people in the world don't have that freedom. And so I want to use it to challenge, ironically, to challenge the very systems that oppress, right? The communities that at least I represent in my legal work and in my research.
Wonderful. So do we have questions?
Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. I love that last question. So we do want to open it up now to any questions from our in-person audience, or type them in the Q&A box on Crowdcast, and we'll just see if we have any thoughts that came up. I'm going to bring you the microphone so everyone.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Very illuminating talk, obviously. Appreciate that. My name is Dara, sitting next to my wife here, Mitra. We are frequent visitors to these talks. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that you're actually encouraging critical thinking in the area of racial discrimination in this country, religious. This country has lots of it. Racial is not the only one. I mean, we have economic discrimination, social discriminations, as Dr. Ghamari put it, gender discrimination, historical, you name it. Sometimes I think the reason we have all these laws that prohibit discrimination is because we have all of these problems, and we really need to seriously deal with it. But I want to take a segue, and since you said, I want to provoke critical thinking. I'm thinking that living in Islamic communities here in the state, that when questions of discrimination, whether it be racial or religious, if it's limited to that, to just that, say it's religious discrimination against Muslims, say specifically, we can deal with that. We can overcome it actually quite easily, just by facts alone, as it turns out. Remember when you mentioned 9/11? Remember initially it was blamed on Muslims, until of course 2 days later we found out that all the perpetrators were Saudi national. 19 out of the 20. So it kind of comes back to bite us in the backs. So anyway, the facts are on our favor, so we can deal with it. It only becomes a serious issue when it's combined or it's convoluted with other discriminatory issues, such as social, being in a disadvantaged social or economic or even like you said, historical, gender, all those issues. That's when it becomes complicated to tackle. Am I in the right?
Well, I'll respond when you're finished. Go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted your opinion on whether I'm on the right track or not.
Yeah. So I don't agree with that description, because the way that racialization works is the facts don't matter, unfortunately. The people who believe, and there are polls out there, so that you go to the Pew Research Center, go to Gallup, go to the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, there's many, just Google it, you'll find so many polls that show that a large number of people believe that Islam teaches violence. And so when we know that's not true. I mean, anybody who studies the religion knows this, whether they're Muslim or not Muslim. We know that doesn't mean that there aren't people who use religious justifications to engage in politically motivated violence, but that happens in every religion, and frankly in any secular ideology as well, whether it's communism or capitalism or liberalism. So the way racialization works is you're out of the world of facts, and you're in the world of stereotypes, and you're in the world of you're in the world of imposing and imputing these stereotypes on people, irrespective of who they are. And what we saw in 9/11, post 9/11, because I was working a lot with many of the organizations that were getting the complaints, the intake, whether it's the Council on American Islamic Relations, Muslim Advocates, Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, South Asian Legal Defense Education. There's many nonprofits, actually most of them who were created after 9/11 to deal with the discrimination, many of them against highly educated people. In the workplace, they were getting discriminated. They were getting, they were on watch lists, travel watch lists. They couldn't get off. They didn't know how they got on. They kept getting harassed at the airport. Some of them were on no-fly lists, so they couldn't even fly in an airplane. And they had no idea, there was no due process. You didn't even know why. And some of these people were very highly educated people and successful people in terms of their as measured by material wealth. And they would have FBI come and visit them at home and at work without any warrant, and just say, we just want to talk to you. You don't mind if you cooperate. You don't have anything to hide, do you? And of course, that would get them into this web of investigations. Plus, it would send a signal to all their coworkers that, did you see Muhammad? The FBI just came to talk to him. It doesn't matter whether he's guilty, not guilty, a suspect, a witness. I mean, the list goes on, and I've written a lot about those consequences. And children were being bullied in school, and women were being attacked, and men and Sikhs who aren't even Muslim were wearing the turbans, were getting killed and attacked. So, unfortunately, this is where if only we could fix it by just being like in an academic center, saying, well, here are the facts. And that's not how it works. It's much, much more challenging than that. And you have to you've got to work on media. You've got to look at Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Right? These are elected officials in the U.S. Congress. I don't know how much higher status that is, right? And look at the way that they're attacked and vilified and the vitriol. And you think, there's actually no respect for them. Look at the way Barack Obama was treated. That was, to me, the way, remember there was that congressman who stood up when he was giving the State of the Union and said, you are a liar. Nobody does that to the President of the United States. So that shows a complete lack of respect for him. And that had everything to do with the fact that he was a black man. Even though he was Harvard educated, Columbia educated, the editor-in-chief. And his middle name was Hussein, right? So the point is, unfortunately, this is why racism is so pernicious, because you are now just one of a collective group that is presumed to have negative innate and biological-like traits. And the only way you escape it is by individually trying to prove your innocence. So you may be fortunate that in your particular workplace, in your particular school, in your particular neighborhood, you were able to have those personal relationships to convince those people who have some authority or some influence over your dignitary and material rights that, hey, I'm good, I'm not that stereotype. And so you can kind of shield yourself from it. But that doesn't change the system. And one thing that I just wanted to mention that I talk about in the book is I argue that the racial Muslim social construct is a hierarchy, not a dichotomy. It's not just the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. But it helps to also explain, because you always get people say, well, I'm a Muslim. I never got stopped at the airport. I never got harassed. And so therefore, because the sample size of one means that this problem is being exaggerated. So putting aside the problem with the kind of statistical analysis or conclusions, what I argue is that yes, there are people who are more likely to be targeted and people that are less likely to be targeted, and that is due to the coercive assimilationism, the Orientalism, and the kind of white Protestant dominance factors. And those people are, if you are religious, like practicing, and you are dissident, especially when it comes to American foreign policy in Muslim majority countries, you are more likely to be targeted. If you are secular, meaning you don't practice, you're just Muslim by name, for lack of a better term, you're a cultural Muslim, You're totally assimilated into kind of white American Protestant norms, and you're not political or you're mainstream politics, you're least likely, and that's the closest you get to the good Muslim, right? And then in between you have the religious racial Muslim, who's not political or just mainstream political, and then the secular dissident, who is a dissident political but is secular, so insofar as there's really no case to be made of, well, Hamas might recruit you, Al-Qaeda might recruit you, ISIS might recruit you. Because if you're religious, that is what makes you, when you think that ISIS is Islamic, when it represents Islam, when you think Al-Qaeda represents Islam, then by extension the logic is all people who are religious are then recruits, potential recruits. Rather than seeing them as a political organization that uses Islam to justify its politics. And all you have to do is say how many people are in your membership and how many Muslims are in the world. So clearly, this is very unique to that geopolitical context. And it's very intentional that the government, the media, school books, all the sources of information do not provide the geopolitical context. Because if they did, then many of us would be dissidents against American foreign policy. Because many of us would start to go, wait a minute, is it really in the U.S.'s best interest to go into Afghanistan? Is this really improving security? How is this creating more war, more conflict? How many people are dying? How would people in that part of the world respond if people were dying and being droned? How would we respond if people were being droned and out of thin air you're just bombed and you die? And there's no judicial process whatsoever. The country doesn't want people to ask those questions. What the government wants is people to go, they're bad, they're evil, shut up, listen to us, be blindly loyal, and be very afraid and thankful that we are protecting you from those savages.
So perhaps with those critical questions, we should wrap it up.
Unfortunately, yes, I'm so sorry that we're at time, but that was a wonderful question and very thought-provoking. And did you have a question?
I don't have time.
Okay.
I don't want to.
Okay. Well, if you guys have time and phone broadcast.
Yeah, no, of course. If there are questions from.
We'll do one more if that's okay.
Okay, so I'll just be really fast, which is, and I apologize, I haven't read the book if you talk about it in more detail there, but I would just be curious to hear a little bit more about how Muslim or anti-Muslim racialization essentially is different from the sort of taxonomies of racialization that have essentially, characterized the United States. I mean, right, it's been racializing violently and institutionally since the get-go. And there's almost a kind of taxonomy of kind of forms of racial violence, from slavery to settler colonial violence and so on and so forth. Do you see Muslim racialization as just one permutation that makes sense within the broader logic of racisms, or do you see it as unique and something that is like sort of not comparable to sort of anti-black racism or anti-indigenous racism? And is Islam the thing that kind of differentiates it? Is there something about the kind of Islam versus secularism problem that maybe holds in the kind of American imaginary Muslims apart from black or Asian or immigrant, in that broad category of immigrant?
So no, I do see it within. I see the process as not unique to Muslims. The process of racialization. What is unique, and it's not unique to Muslims, but what I find you must analyze when examining and understanding racism against different groups is what are those factors that feed into the process, right? So if you think of, what are the inputs? And the inputs are different. And there's domestic and there's international inputs. Now, I think there's one thing that is, two things that are common inputs, which is white Protestant, Northwestern European Protestant dominance. That has certainly been a factor in whether it's the enslavement of Africans, the genocide of Native Americans, the various forms of discrimination, racism against Asian, and then the xenophobia. America has a history of xenophobia against new immigrants. If they don't belong to the people who we're taught are like their founding fathers, right? Their founding generation. So those two, but how it manifests itself then depends on the particularities of that group. So the Japanese were interned en masse 2/3 of whom were US citizens. But they all were suspected of being loyal to the Japanese king, right? And part of it was because of their religion, by the way, Shintoism. And that was very much about xenophobia against Asians and the stereotype that they're duplicitous, they're sneaky, you can't trust them, right? They're foreign. And related to the war, the international, there was a world war, and so they were collectively punished. And that's different than, looking at the situation of Muslims or people from Muslim majority countries. But I think the process is not unique. They're creating the insiders and the outsiders, having to have a boogeyman, someone who's an outsider, collectively punishing individuals on a group, as a group for acts that are not even within their control and logics that are or rationales that are not even based in fact. That's America's race problem in a nutshell. And so this book is really trying to add to that literature and that conversation to say, here's how there are similarities, and I do talk about some similarities, and here's how it's different. And I intentionally chose Jews, Catholics, and Mormons because I found them to be the case studies that were the most similar insofar as it was their religion that was racializing them, in addition to other factors, but religion was playing such a major role, or religious identity was playing such a major role. I think these whole debates about Islam and secularism, that's all Orientalism to me. That is just Orientalism. These are manufactured debates. And this is this exceptionalization of Islam. And that's part of the trap, right? I mean, if we want to have a serious conversation about Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic philosophy and the rich history, right, of Islam over centuries and across continents, that's a really interesting conversation to have. But to say, well, Islam is anti-secular, anti-liberal, that doesn't even make any sense to me. It's like, that's so simplistic that it's not even worth entertaining. But how convenient it is to use that simple language, because what's the objective? The objective is social control. The state wants to control how you behave and give it carte blanche to engage in what it wants to serve the interests of whoever controls the state and the powerful. That's ultimately what's going on. And when you're in a democracy, rather than saying, shut up, go to the margin, you can't speak, you can't do anything, if you do, I'll put you in jail, the state has to work harder in propaganda and misinformation and oversimplification to persuade you or to get you to be complacent or to distract you to focus on buying things. Let me just buy as many things as I want. And then I won't be paying attention to the millions of dollars that I'm paying to go kill people abroad in my name. And yet I am definitely someone who believes in human rights. But what's the latest iPhone? And there's kind of a whole system to that too going on. That, by the way, is spreading throughout the world. And this is creating an intentional depoliticization of people, because then that allows those in power to be able to just do it as they choose. So I know that was a little broader response that you wanted, but ultimately, I see everything as concentric circles. But I do hope that you read the book, and hopefully that will also help answer your question in more depth. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad we added that question because it was really interesting. So thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to our audience, virtual and in person. I should mention that we do have the book available at the back of the room if you're interested, from our partner Labyrinth Books. And otherwise, I would ask that you exit via the plaza if you don't mind, and we hope you check our calendar for future events. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.